Welcome to A Drink with John. This time I am joined by an old friend of mine, a man I admire very much, one of the great prelates of the American Catholic Church, Archbishop Charles Chaput, formerly of Denver, currently of Philadelphia. We find ourselves together here in New York at the Sheen Center for the launch of Archbishop Chaput's new book, Strangers in a Strange Land. Archbishop Chaput, thanks for having a drink with me tonight.
Happy to do it, John. Can I toast you?
Chin chin.
Chin chin. Thank you.
So how are you?
Well, right now, I'm pretty excited about the book that's coming out. It's actually been published a few days ago, and I've received good news on the attention it's getting from people. They're buying copies of it. It's in third printing already after just a week, and is doing well in terms of Amazon sales. So I'm pretty excited about it all.
You've always been a kind of high-tech guy. You're very aware of these kinds
I'm
of
aware,
things.
but not a very good technician myself.
Listen, in the abstract, of course, lots of bishops publish books and so forth. But often the books they publish tend to be pretty churchy kind of tomes. Not that you were not a man of the church, obviously, but your interests have always been, I wouldn't say narrowly ecclesiastical. I mean, and this book is really an exercise in cultural criticism, isn't it?
I think it would be correct. It's born out of my own personal experience and my frustration with the culture in which I live. I'm disappointed at the direction we've gone in some ways over the course of the last 40 or 50 years. I'm very pleased, of course, by other things that have been part of our cultural developments. We certainly live in a world where people can be healthier and happier than in the past, but also the same world is a place where people can have tragic experiences. One thing that comes to my mind is, I have many friends who have children with disabilities, and it's obvious, over the course of these last many decades that our countries, our society's care for people with disabilities has gotten much better. People are much more included in the life of our communities. But at the same time, it's the culture that kills people with disabilities in the womb in ways that never happened before. There are very few children today who are born with Down syndrome because people can detect that early on, and children are aborted. So the same society with the same kind of technology can use that technology in ways that serve us more radically generously, or in ways that are more radically selfish and sad. So that's the kind of confusion that I write about in the book.
Now, listen, the gist of this book, in many ways, is that in the United States of the early 21st century, we are living in a post-Christian culture.
Right.
Now, some people might find that a very counterintuitive claim. I mean, if you look at the lists that you can find in the internet of the most Christian countries on earth, you will always find the United States in position number one. We have 227 million people who identify themselves as Christians. Christian concerns, Christian values always play an enormously important role in our politics. Many people would say that they were decisive, actually, in the 2016 election. Mm-hmm. So the idea that this is a post-Christian society, on the face of it, might strike people as a kind of alarmist diagnosis.
Right.
Why do you use that vocabulary to describe where we are today?
Well, I'd like to agree with you that in some ways it's wrong ever to use the expression post-Christian because, Christ is always the center of life and history, whether we acknowledge it or not. So in reality, we're not living in a post-Christian time. But in terms of church practice, the numbers of people attending Christian services on Sunday, whether they're Protestants or Catholics, is much less than it was in the past. The gospel principles in terms of family life are not embraced now as they were in the past. I think that we live in a much more diverse society in the United States than before in terms of people practicing other forms of religious faith. So it used to be that we defined our country as a Judeo-Christian country in terms of our heritage. There's a resistance to even talk that way among some of the elites of today. I think it's not true, they say. we're no longer a Christian country. I think even, I don't mean this as a criticism. I'm trying to remember the facts, but it seems to me that President Obama actually said that we're no longer a Christian country. Now,
And you actually write in the book that the election of Barack Obama in 2008 was a kind of watershed
right.
for America. That it in some sense represented the advent of a new way of conceiving American society that was no longer based on a set of shared values ultimately rooted in biblical faith.
Right, and I think that President Obama had a certain kind of commitment and energy behind that led him to lead our country in a different direction. The example that comes immediately to mind would be the understanding of meaning of marriage. Of course, that was in the end a decision of our Supreme Court that gay marriage would be recognized as with the same in the same way as traditional marriage. But I think that it was interesting to see how President Obama himself changed his position on that during the course of his time as the president. And Vice President Biden actually performed a gay marriage in his office somewhere I don't know where it was, actually in Washington, D.C. So I think they took active and somewhat aggressive leadership in that direction. In terms of the Health and Human Services mandates, in terms of imposing a contraceptive practice on insurance programs in the country, that leadership was taken by the White House and unnecessarily in terms of the law itself. So I think that it was a watershed, and it continues to show itself in the direction of our society. People are surprised by the focus that we now have on transgenderism, but I think it also had its origin in that period. And the White House issued directives, which have now been countermanded, I think they've been countermanded by President Trump, directing that people can use the bathroom of their choice depending on their biological sex. So I think all those things demonstrate a watershed that is going in the direction that is contrary to traditional Christian moral principles in terms of.
And you write in the book that the election of President Trump in 2016 was a reaction to, not a repeal of, these trends that you're talking about, right? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think it may be a stopgap, a moment, where there's a pause on the direction that we have been going. I don't think it's going to be a permanent pause, because I think these trends have been part of our culture for the last 40 or 50 years, and the election of one man is not going to change things. I think it was in part a reaction. I certainly don't think that's the reason for his election in and of itself.
Well, in addition, of course, you also write that both Trump and Clinton in 2016 were deeply flawed candidates. One thing that might surprise people, just so you know, I have a column ready to go about you, in which I'm saying that you are a classic example of how the political stereotypes that we often want to apply to church leaders, that is, liberal or conservative, often mislead more than they inform, because you have also been sharply critical of the early policies, the early moves of the Trump administration, for example, on refugees and immigrants.
Certainly. And I certainly will continue to do that. During the campaign, I tried to speak clearly about how I thought about the candidates, because people asked me, and I would receive criticism from those who supported Trump as being not pro-life enough, and I would receive criticism by those defending Secretary Clinton as not being Catholic enough in terms of the immigration policies and the like. So I get equal criticism from both sides. But I think that's something that you happily risk if you try to speak the truth with honesty.
Well, I've known you for better than 20 years. If anybody thinks that you are not pro-life enough, I'm not sure what planet these people are living on.
Well, that's what they tell me.
All right. Well, listen, the way you couch your argument in this book is, in many ways, this book is a wake-up call, right? It's sort of trying to grab Christians, and particularly Catholics, of course, in America, by the scruff of the neck and sort of shake them and say, listen, the culture you're living in today is not the culture we were living in when we grew up. And the prospects for the faith in this culture are not what they used to be, and we need to wake up to that reality.
Yes, and I also say I don't think it's going to come back. What we experienced in the past is not going to come back.
Yeah, so I mean, we've got to make our peace in some ways with this new
We have to make our
reality.
peace, and we have to be activists in making peace. We can't just be passive.
Okay, so speaking of being activists, let's come to that. In a culture that, in some ways at least, could be described as post-Christian, in which this consensus we once had on a shared set of values that were antecedent to the state, that were not up for debate, right, and that were ultimately rooted in biblical faith. So things like the centrality of the family, right, the biological difference between men and women, right, the absolute unacceptability of killing innocent life, right, all of which are no longer universally shared and beyond debate values, right? In that kind of world, okay, what does the church need to do?
Well, we need to first of all be aware of what's going on in the world around us. I think many people of my generation are somewhat anxious about what's going on, but they haven't really analyzed in a very serious way how we got from where we were to how we got today. And so in the book I try to point out some of the factors that were active in our culture that led where we are today. So we have to be aware of it, but then we also have to have hope that we can live in this culture in a way that we can be full-throated, committed Christians. And we can pass that faith on to our children.
I mean, are you talking about the Benedict XVI, the idea of being a creative minority in this culture? What are you talking about?
Well, if we are a minority, we need to be a creative minority. You know, I'm not. People sometimes say you want the church to be smaller. I don't. I think it's going to be smaller, but I don't wish that were the fact. But if we are going to be smaller, we're not going to have the high ground anymore. We need to find ways of being creative and to be confident about our Christian faith, even in the face of the rejection of segments of our society. They are going to reject us. They're going to make fun of us. We have to be able to pass the gift of faith on to our children. And I think that's probably the most difficult thing that people have to deal with. How do you raise your kids as Christians in a world that is largely post-Christian, as you say, in a culture rather that's largely post-Christian?
And what's your answer to that?
Well, the answer is you have to be personally converted and convinced of the faith. You can't pass it on if you don't have it. Parents are going to be more important in the faith life of their children than they have been in the past, because in the past the culture supported that faith life. The schools basically supported that faith life. The Christian communities were strong. People were expected to go to church, and that would support that faith life. Now it's really going to be the family that's going to be the primary tool that God will use to evangelize, beginning with their children, of course. But then families associating together in smaller groups, support groups for one another will be very important in the future as well. That's what parishes are supposed to be, but they're institutions now rather than support groups.
Yeah, although, I mean, I have to say that was one element of your book that I found myself reflecting on. Because, you know, I've lived much of my adult life in Europe. And I will say that comparing the typical European parish to the typical American parish, I find our parishes much more dynamic, much more flourishing,
Sure.
much more nourishing of authentic Christian life. I mean, at least they're not just like sacramental filling stations, right? Where you pull in for a marriage or a baptism, but other than that, you really have no actual connection with the parish. You know, my read would, of course, there are more than 17,000 parishes in America, and it's silly to talk in generalizations.
Sure.
But, you know, on the whole, I mean, my read would be our parishes are comparatively healthy.
Well, they are compared to Europe, but you know, let me use my own life as an example again. I was the Bishop of Rapid City, South Dakota. I was the Bishop of Denver, and now I'm the Bishop of Philadelphia. When I came to Philadelphia 5 years ago, I was astonished at how different the communities of faith looked there than they did in Denver. They were much older. There were fewer young people. There were many fewer children than there were in the churches, in the parishes of Denver. So in some ways, I think it depends on what part of the country you live
Sure.
in. There are many extraordinary examples of vibrant faith, many parishes, many like that. But there are also many parishes that are substantially dead. You know, there aren't significant activities going on to nourish faith because there aren't people who attend those
I
communities.
just flourish on something that John Paul II said once. You know, John Paul II was once asked, why have the new movements taken off in Europe in a way they never did in the United States? And his answer was the United States was one of the few countries in the world in which the renewal of the parish called for by the Second Vatican Council actually happened.
I think it did. But I also think our parishes are aging, fewer people are participating, and we need to look at new ways of being parishes. You know, for example, young people, young adults. In Philadelphia and in Denver, they didn't go to the same parish every Sunday. There was a lot more mobile
Sure.
church attendance.
Sure.
They didn't contribute significantly financially to keep their parish financially solvent. We have to kind of meet that new kind of reality that's going on. What are the young adults of the future going to find nourishing in terms of the faith?
So
the traditional
your basic prescription here is, first of all, encourage people to build stable, loving, flourishing Catholic families.
Yes.
And then secondly, find ways for those families to network and
Yes.
to support each other, which may, in some circumstances, it would be the ideal, of course, be through the parish.
Sure.
Right? Where that, for whatever reason, doesn't work, find other ways to do it, whether
right.
that's a movement or whether that's bringing them together in some kind of informal way. But
And those
sort
of us who are responsible as bishops and pastors have to make sure whatever we're doing actually works. And that means we can't wholeheartedly ascribe to the practice of the past, saying you have to go to church in your church boundaries. You know, that if people aren't registered in the parish, they're not good Catholics. Those kind of things don't work anymore.
Yeah. Okay, before we finish, let me just put on my Vaticanista hat for a minute and ask you two Pope questions.
Yes.
One, in some press coverage, you are sometimes styled as, spun as, sort of put up as one of the opponents or the critics of Pope Francis. Now, if you actually read this book, Strangers in a Strange Land, you quote Pope Francis consistently throughout it and approvingly. There obviously is an affection and respect there. So what is your actual take on Pope Francis?
Well, I think Pope Francis is a interesting man, and you know he's a pope first of all. So my take on him is he succeeded to the role of Peter as the vicar of Christ, and it's very important for those of us who are bishops to maintain enthusiastic unity in the life of the church and to be supportive of the Holy Father because of that. At the same time, he's being a pope in a way that's very different from his predecessors, and that has been confusing for people. And I think it's important for us to help the Holy Father understand that, but also to help people understand the Holy Father and to do what we can to help people through the confusion and disappointment I think some people are experiencing. And we can't, as bishops, we can't do it that alone. We have to do it in conjunction with the Holy Father. He has to be aware of that confusion, and I think he has a responsibility in responding to it as well as of us responding to it.
Now, specifically, I mean, one of the leitmotifs that runs through this book is your concern for marriage and for the institution of marriage.
Right.
Now, you know that the Church is going through its own debate on that issue at the moment, which was triggered by the Holy Father's document, Amoris Laetitia, and specifically the question of whether divorced and civilly remarried Catholics, that is, Catholics who divorce and then remarry outside the Church, could, under some circumstances, be eligible for the sacrament of communion. You have put out your own guidelines for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, in which you indicate that there has been no change between John Paul's document Familiaris Consortio in 1981 and now, which is the only set of circumstances under which a divorced and civilly remarried couple could receive communion is if they're living as brother and sister.
Right.
Okay. You are well aware that there are bishops in other parts of the world who have put out statements or guidelines that are different than that,
Right.
that indicate that no, we don't have to require that in order for these people to be eligible for communion. There are some who see that as kind of chaos and confusion, others who see it as a sort of healthy diversity, I suppose. I guess what I want to ask is if there were some kind of binding magisterial declaration from the Vatican saying that the answer to this question is yes. That is, divorced and civilly remarried Catholics without an annulment and without living as brother and sister could be eligible for the sacrament of communion. What would that do, in your opinion, to our witness to marriage?
Well, St. Francis of Assisi encouraged the brothers, the Franciscan brothers, to accept the gospel without gloss. And glosses were convoluted efforts to have the gospel say something that it didn't say, or
To take the edge off.
didn't really mean what Jesus didn't really mean what he said. So it seems to me that we ought to take Jesus at his word, and his word about divorce and remarriage, about it being adultery, are very clear. I mean, there's just no doubt about what Jesus said in the Gospels. So it seems to me that it's impossible for us to contradict the words of Jesus, and it's also not possible for a teaching to be true 20 years ago and not to be true today when it's the teachings of the Pope. So the teachings of Pope Francis can't contradict the teachings of John Paul II when it is a matter of official teaching. So it seems to me that we have to interpret Lemor's Laetitia in the light of what's gone before it, primarily the words of Jesus, but secondarily the teachings of the Pope, the magisterium of the Church. And so how can it be true that people can receive communion when they're living in an adulterous union today? How is that possible when the Church says it's not possible in the past?
Do you want the Pope to answer the dubia?
Yes, I think it's always good to answer questions clearly and
Even if the answer doesn't go in the direction you might want?
absolutely.
Okay. Do you think you will?
I don't know. He certainly has opportunities to do that. And
If this were a sports bet in a Las Vegas casino and you were going to go over under, I would recommend under.
I don't really know what he'll do. He
All
hasn't
right.
told me.
Archbishop, you are, of course, people might have different opinions about particular positions you will take, but you are unfailingly one of the most interesting, one of the most thoughtful, one of the most intelligent, and I would also add, one of the most gracious men in the Catholic Church.
Thank you.
And I can't thank you enough, not just for agreeing to do this, but for your friendship over the years.
Thank you, John.
Archbishop.
Thanks for the interview.
Thank you. This has been A Drink with John. Join us next time on Crux.